James Creedon, hello.
Good evening.
We start with the unrest in Ferguson, Missouri, and the role Twitter has played in the coverage of the story.
That's right. So it's been going since last Wednesday now, and news organisations and news websites have been analysing the role that Twitter has played in the coverage of this story. As you often see news organisations doing now after a big event that gets a lot of social media coverage. So Ferguson essentially became hashtag Ferguson in the way it was being covered in the media because the social media element of the story was so big. In the New York Times, David Carr writes that on Wednesday evening of last week, if you turned on any of the major networks in the US, for example, CNN, there were tributes to Lauren Bacall. There was wall-to-wall coverage of the rescue effort in northern Iraq, but a story that was going on at home was getting very, very little coverage on Wednesday evening. And the web, as he says, crackled with one story and one story only, a militarised response to a mostly non-violent expression of free speech. This, of course, was after the shooting dead of Michael Brown in Ferguson, a suburb of St. Louis. So, in fact, the web, as is often the case with these stories, was ahead of cable news. And Twitter has become an early warning service for news organisations and a way to see into stories when you don't necessarily have significant reporting assets on the ground, writes David Carr. He also says that a Washington Post reporter, Wesley Laurie, and Ryan Riley of the Huffington Post were both arrested at a McDonald's, and actually their news organisations found out about this via Twitter and were able to intervene or try to get them out of jail because of finding out about this via Twitter and social media generally. So even critics actually were convinced, Jade. One reporter, one correspondent for the NBC network, Ron Mott, who is a social media skeptic, he said, as powerful as our press has been through the years of our democracy, social media raises temp on public officials like never before. So I think a degree of consensus about the role that it had. Now, Twitter is not unaware of the fact that it's getting a lot of positive PR through the coverage of this, and what they've actually done is they've released what I think you call them geothermal maps. Perhaps not geothermal, but in any case, you can get geotagged rather, and you can get a sense here of how that story evolved and how it essentially sort of exploded across social media in the hours that followed the story getting its initial coverage on social networks. And what you've had actually over the weekend as well is one of the co-founders of Twitter, Jack Dorsey, who's actually from St. Louis, who decided to spend the weekend at home. He even marched with one of the most prominent local officials who was indeed arrested. That's Antonio French, and was very much featuring images of himself alongside Antonio French on his own social media, on his own Twitter account at Jack. So he might actually very genuinely feel involved in that story, seeing as he's a local of St. Louis, but it's also good PR for his social network.
Yeah, undoubtedly. All right, well, moving on to another story now, and a French politician has drawn criticism for remarks that she made on Facebook today about a veiled woman at the beach.
That's right. Nadine Morano, she's of the centre-right UMP party, best known for being a very prominent defender of Nicolas Sarkozy. She's one of his most prominent defenders in the party. Now, what she did is she drew attention to, on a French beach, a woman who was sitting there minding her own business, wearing a Muslim veil, which you're perfectly entitled to do at the beach. France is known, of course, for having quite a tough stance in terms of its secular laws known as laïcité, which means that in a public building, in a public space, you're not meant to in any way wear signs that show your religious affiliation. And what she did on her Facebook was she contrasted this woman sitting minding her own business, not covering her face, which is illegal in the public space in France, but just simply sitting there with a veil on. She contrasted that with Brigitte Bardot, who's on the front page of Le Figaro magazine this week, and said that this icon of France, on the front page of Le Figaro, and now what do we see on the beaches of France nowadays but veiled women. So essentially she's been criticised for making what are essentially racist remarks, and remarks that don't really have any basis in law. As the Huffington Post.fr says, the law is very clear on this matter. In a private setting, you're allowed to do whatever you want, as long as you're not trying to spread your religion or distributing tracts or distributing leaflets. You're perfectly entitled to sit there and wear the veil, wear a cross, wear a kippah, whatever you want. So a lot of people on Twitter making the point that this is a pretty bizarre statement to have made on Facebook, and some people tweeting images of nuns on beaches saying that perhaps Nadine Morano wouldn't have been as upset by that.
I wonder what she'd make of the face kini trend in China.
Right, she probably wouldn't like that
No.
either. And indeed, SOS Racisme, which is an anti-racism NGO in France, said it's an interesting concept of secularism that she seems to have, and bizarrely also a proximity with Brigitte Bardot, who has made no secret of her far-right affiliations in recent years.
Absolutely. All right. Thanks very much for that look at
Thanks,
what's
Jade.
making waves on the web, Jane Keegan. Right, time now for our focus report. And today we head to South Korea, where Pope Francis